Last year, I was really interested in finding out one question on the NFL. Are injuries increasing? Now, we know that there's a lot of rule changes that have been in place within the last few years in order to try to mitigate injuries from occurring. But is that actually working? I don't want to just find out if injuries are increasing. I want to find out what type of injuries those are. Not only that, I want to know what type of positions are getting hurt more than others. Are there any positions that are rising within the last 12 years? Of those positions, what injuries are most prevalent? Are there different injuries for different positional groups? These were the questions that I was having, but none of the answers online were given to me, or at least I didn't really feel like it was a reputable source. So, what did I do? I did it myself. I pulled together over 12 years of NFL data, every player, every week, every year from 2010 to the 2023-2024 season to answer these questions. With about over 12 seasons of data, accounting for about 23,000 rows in Excel, it took me a little over a year to clean. It actually didn't really take me a full year to clean this data. When I started this project back in April of last year, I got really busy. I ended up taking an internship role with the University of Michigan football team, working with their sports science department for the summer, and then I had to come back and finish my master's in biomechanics. So it was definitely an on and off project, but I'm happy to say that it is completed now, and I'm ready to share what I found. So here's the amount of unique injuries for each season in the NFL, and when running a regression analysis, it is statistically significant. But there is something missing here. Starting in the 2021 season, the NFL announced that they would be playing an additional game every single year, accounting for now 17 total games instead of 16 before. That's something that we have to account for. When adjusting for the relative weeks for each season, the data now looks like this. It definitely does not have as much of an increase as it used to, but it is still statistically significant from each other. As the 2010 season had on average approximately 51 injuries in a week, while the 2023 season reported 72 injuries in a week. So it's apparent that injuries have been increasing in the last decade, but what type of injuries are showing up? Which ones are popping up the most? Throughout this time window, the most frequent injury to pop up was the knee, followed by the ankle, the hamstring, concussion, then the shoulder and the groin. The knee is one of the most useful joints in the human body for athletic performance, but it is also home to some of the most brutal injuries. I actually have a specific video on the ACL and the susceptibility that it has during cutting movement. So if you're interested in learning more about knee injuries, specifically the ACL, check out that video after. Back to this project though, a deeper analysis will have to be administered to understand whether or not these injuries or what percentage of these injuries are contact related versus non-contact related, and specifically what knee injuries or what shoulder injuries are occurring. Now, shifting gears a little bit, what about the most injured position? Before this project and analysis, I really thought that it would have been something like the running back, because they are often undersized compared to the big defensive players and get hit almost every play, because if they're not running the ball, they're normally protecting the quarterback from the pass rush and the defense. However, they are not the most injured player within the last decade, not according to this project at least. To my surprise, the position that showed up the most amount of times was the linebacker, followed by the cornerback, the wide receiver, the safeties, and then the running backs. When graphing these positional groups over time, the cornerbacks, wide receivers, and linebackers have seen increases. Even with some of the rule changes about the Defensive Receiver Acts trying to protect wide receivers, they are still getting injured at an alarming rate. But that begs the question to look a little bit deeper at the wide receivers. What injuries are they having? We can see that hamstring injuries are the most common injury among the position, followed by the knee and the ankle. Over time, we can see that these three injuries are steadily rising. But this isn't just a receiver trend. Let's look at all of the skill positional groups: wide receivers, cornerbacks, running backs, and safeties. We can see that the top three injuries are all the same, with the hamstrings being one of the main injuries to increase in frequency. So why are hamstring injuries so common for skill position players? Well, when looking at these skill position players, they each all have some sort of sprint action. And when looking at sprinters and sprinting mechanics, hamstring injuries do pop up every now and then for a multitude of different reasons. Now keep in mind that this project did not have that deep of an analysis in terms of what type of injuries these are. We don't know the exact amount of percentage of non-contact versus contact hamstring related injuries these are. However, according to Elliott and their team in 2011, 81.5% of hamstring strains are non-contact in the NFL, with 71% citing sprinting as the primary activity during the time of injury. According to some of the literature, this could be due to inadequate flexibility of the muscles, inadequate muscle strength, neuromuscular fatigue, or an awkward running style. Neuromuscular fatigue, for example, can be monitored by someone like a sports scientist at these professional organizations using force plate technology. Basically, the player will jump on a set of force plates, and using the metrics, these sports scientists can figure out whether or not the acute or chronic fatigue levels that a player exhibits before or after a game, and monitoring these will be able to hopefully help reduce the amount of neuromuscular fatigue and therefore have every muscle firing at the maximum capacity. I do have a video that talks a little bit more in depth about how these sports scientists are able to monitor neuromuscular fatigue using these pieces of technology. So if this is something that's interesting to you in terms of injury prevention monitoring, check it out. Going back to sprinting mechanics now, when you actually look in depth at the sprinting biomechanics, you can see that there's repeated eccentric loads that are put onto the hamstring during heel strike, which could cause an injury based on the eccentric deficiency or improper sprinting mechanics that this individual has, which basically just leads to a bunch of loading on the hamstring. When you move a muscle, there are three actions that the muscle can do. Concentric, which is like a contraction, isometric, which is like a static hold, and eccentric, which is a lengthening action. Exercises like hamstring curls or glute bridges are a few examples of concentric hamstring exercises, but if you did have deficiency in eccentric loading of the hamstring during sprinting, it could be improper or neglection of eccentric loading of the hamstring during your training protocol. Movements like the Nordic curls or the flywheel K-box trainings are good ways that have been empirically implemented in eccentric loading of the hamstrings and show not only to reduce injury risk but to increase performance. However, for big skill group players such as tight ends, linebackers, defensive ends, and fullbacks, hamstring isn't really as much of a problem as the knee and ankle are back to being the most prominent injuries. The same trend is present with the bigs, the defensive tackles, the centers, and the guards. Regardless of the NFL's regulations on certain types of blocks, such as the peel back block and the chop block, there is no decrease in injury frequency. This increase in knee injuries might suggest, though, for the bigs that it's not necessarily contact injuries based on the different types of blocks, as much as it is a non-contact injury of the knee. I feel like we're talking so much about knee injuries that we're neglecting the other big injury at the moment of ankle injuries. Ankle injuries are huge. They've popped up in pretty much every single positional group, and they're the second highest overall injury in the NFL. And this is due to just the nature of how the NFL is played, with a lot of rotational force getting put onto the foundational piece, that ankle joint being the foundation, and all these rotational forces getting put on the ankle. There is a need for big ankle strength in order for contact and non-contact injuries to be potentially prevented by the ankle. Additionally, Achilles tendon injuries are common specifically in the beginning of the season or in training camp when athletes are deconditioned and quickly return to explosive push-off activities. I know this video is getting kind of doomer in the terms of just how many injuries are increasing and how football, being a very physical sport, is still seeing increases despite the laws and regulations and the new rules that the NFL has been placing. But you know what we haven't seen that much of, which is a great sign, is concussions. This entire time we haven't really talked that much about concussions, even though concussions might be one of the biggest injuries for this game. Substantial regulations have been placed for head-to-head contact and regulating the amount of head contact injuries that are occurring in the NFL, and it has been showing in the data. Not only that, sports scientists have been able to use such technology as the head impact telemetry system, or the HIT system, in order to provide real-time monitoring of the head impacts through a measurement called the head impact exposures, or HIE. However, it's not all sunshine and rainbows, because this injury, the concussion, is still fourth in frequency overall in the NFL, and has nearly doubled since the 2010 season. Thankfully though, a lot more discussion has been talked about with concussions, specifically CTE, and the effects, the long-term effects that these head impacts have on these individual players. So, the unique injuries that have been recorded by the NFL through the injury report system from the 2010 season to the 2023 season have significantly increased. Now, this project does have a lot of limitations to it. I mean, for starters, it was publicly available data, so I'm only working with what I have here, but there are a lot of different limitations here. One of them is not knowing how severe these injuries actually are. This is a subjective viewpoint based on somebody who determines somebody as questionable or probable to start. I mean, that discretion right there could filter out multiple people and could potentially, change the results of this project. Additionally, the terminology of doubtful and questionable could have changed from the 2010 season to relatively today in the 2023 season. Not to mention that the NFL has been shining more light within the last decade on the injuries that have been prevalent in the NFL, thus potentially increasing the amount of stricter injury reporting that has been going on week to week. Therefore, we are seeing more and more people getting put on the injury report every single season. And finally, I think one of the biggest limitations that could potentially have a big impact on this is Vegas. In May of 2018, the US Supreme Court overturned the ruling which banned sports gambling in the Murphy versus the National Collegiate Athletic Association, and as of 2023, sportbooks are legal in 38 states. The influence of sports betting could potentially have some implications for the amount of players getting listed on the injury report, nonetheless talking about what type of terminology they're using for specific players in order for sports books to create more accurate lines, to predict games a little bit better, and ultimately have a monetary incentive for not only the sports book, but potentially the sports bettor as well. However, prior to the 2018 court ruling that allowed sports gambling to exist, the 2010 to 2017 data also showed an increase in frequency of unique injuries, suggesting that Vegas might not be as much of a confounding variable as previously thought. This is definitely something that I want to continue to work on in terms of this data. There's a lot more questions that I have in terms of looking at specific teams, looking at win rate percentage, if that increases or decreases in terms of the amount of injuries that are occurring. I mean, there's a lot of cool stuff that I can do with this data. But I thought for the for the purpose of this video, I just wanted to get something out. I mean, I've been sitting on this data now for a while. This data had been completed probably a few months ago. I just been so busy that I haven't been able to sit down and actually compute it all and interpret what it all means. So this is going to be potentially part one, depending on how well this video does and how much interest there is. I'll probably continue to do it by myself. It's just, if you guys want to see it, I can make a video about it later on in the future. So make sure you're on the lookout for that. I'm going to try to make more videos. I keep on saying that every single time at the end of these videos. I don't know if there's anybody even watching at this point, but if that's the case, that's awesome. I really appreciate that you spend the time to watch all the way through, or maybe you're asleep on the couch. One of the two. Regardless, I appreciate you being here, listening to my voice, and I want to know your thoughts on this. Did you think it was insightful? Did you think something was surprising or not? I'd love to hear your thoughts. With that being said, I will talk to you later.